My name is Tanya Domi, and I'm an adjunct professor here in our Balkan Studies program. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Emina Muzaferija, who is my colleague at New Lines Institute, where she's the program director and the Western Balkan Center director in that capacity. It's really, really a pleasure. I got to see her present at ASN this past year, and I love working with Emina. And she started telling me about her dissertation, and I said, "Oh, you got to come to Harriman." And I want to thank Mark so much for co-sponsoring the Ukrainian studies and supporting this. And Mark and I have worked together several times before. I remember we did a media panel on Ukraine. Also, we did some, I think I brought you in on the LGBTQ leaders that were in the Maidan. They were so inspirational. My God, that seems like such a long time ago. And then through this heartbreaking war that has definitely cast a long shadow on Bosnia. And I have heard everything many times over about Bosnia-Herzegovina because I've been working on it or teaching about it for 32 years. And I have to say, I've never heard this topic before. So I give you major kudos. The title of this talk is Recovering Territory, the Thick Geopolitics of Demining in Post-War Bosnia and Herzegovina and Wartime Ukraine. I give the floor over to you, Dr. Muzaferija.
Thank you very much, Professor Domi. It really is a pleasure to be here. And I'm very excited to talk to you about a topic that has kept me up at night for the past 4 years. I've dreamt about landmines, demining. That's at some point in my life, that's the only thing I've thought about. So it's a topic that's completely consumed me for a while I was doing the research for my doctoral dissertation. So I want to preface this by saying I am a political geographer. I was born and raised in Bosnia, in the immediate aftermath of the Bosnian War. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today is something that has characterized my post-war childhood, and that is landmines and demining. And before I begin, I want to turn it over to you and ask you, what are some things that come to mind when you think about demining? Well, first associations.
Amputations.
Okay.
Lines of
It's impossible, you think, to like totally demine.
Yes. Any more thoughts?
United Nations UNESCO tends to be tensions involving.
So you probably know and recognize some of these things here. So what I was getting at here, I wanted someone to say peace building, Postwar, and so on. And this is what we typically associate with the term demining. So everyone knows this picture here, right? Princess Diana walking through a minefield in Angola. Everyone's at least once in their life seen a picture like that one. A person manually demining. This one, this picture in particular is from Ukraine. You've seen pictures of landmines too, probably, and it's very likely that these two organizations, the Halo Trust, Mines Advisory Group, and of course, you probably know about the Mine Ban Treaty, which until recently was considered the single most successful disarmament treaty. And you know about the campaign to ban landmines, which culminated in the Mine Ban Treaty in 1997. So this is what people typically think of when they think of demining. It is a humanitarian work that is benign. It is anti-political. It is anti-geopolitical. It is it's a life-saving ritual. And I want to distinguish before we move forward between two different types of demining. On this side, you see Ukrainian armed forces training for military demining. and here is a humanitarian demining. So two basic different types of demining are humanitarian and military. This type has been around ever since the advent of modern landmines, which is the First World War, but it really took off in the Second World War and afterwards. But this type of demining is only a little over a generation old, starting in 1988 and really taking off in the early 90s. And these are very different methods of demining. Military demining is practiced during war. Your focus is on the speed. You want to destroy the landmines as soon as possible so your troops can advance. So you don't care about the extent of clearance. You just want to clear the path so you can move forward. And you do so by exploding the landmines. So you don't care about the natural environment. The focus is on the military objectives. Humanitarian demining, to clear a minefield this way, it takes months, sometimes even years, if it's done in a particularly difficult terrain, like a mountaintop, a rocky terrain, steep slopes, and so on. It is a process that is very tedious, it's slow, it has a lot of different steps, regulations, standards, and so on. And this is what that process looks like. So you start with a suspected area that you suspect is contaminated with landmines, and you do something called non-technical survey. You talk to people, you ask them, have you seen landmines here? Have you seen any sort of evidence of landmines? So this procedure is very long and slow, and it involves checking and rechecking in multiple stages before you get to actual clearance or the technical survey, where you go in with actual metal detectors to see if there are landmines, and if there are, you clear them, and then you finally have cleared land, and you have to issue a certificate saying, we cleared this, there are no landmines here. You issue the certificate to local population or the local or national government. But to understand how this came to be and why it matters to the topic of demining in Bosnia and Ukraine, I want to give you a brief sort of overview of historic events that led to the emergence of humanitarian demining, which is today best understood as something that exists within an international liberal humanitarian demining regime. So we start with 1935. Germans invent something called the Emina 35, short for shrapnel mina 1935. And it is this landmine that completely changed the mine warfare business. It was the very first time that someone managed to combine a maximum explosive capacity in a very small sort of design that you can easily be hidden. And this was the exact technological breakthrough that allowed landmines to proliferate. At the start of the Second World War, Germans had 3 types of landmines. During the Second World War, they invented 16 more types. Today, we have over 700 different types of landmines. So that should tell you the extent of this technological advancement. Once we made this landmine, which to this day is the most notorious landmine to be invented. It's a landmine designed to kill not just the person who steps on it, but everyone within 15 meters distance, which is what in American measurements.
50 meters.
15.
15 meters.
So that's like 45, 50 feet.
So it is a very potent weapon. And Germans figured this out when they deployed it in 1939. The French retreated. They're like, okay, this weapon works. They start innovating more. And as Germans are innovating with landmines, allies are trying to demine. So allies are innovating when it comes to demining technologies. At the end of the Second World War, allies forced German POWs to demine the entire continent of Europe. This raised a lot of eyebrows, but it still, happened within 3 years. Most of Europe was demined. Fast forward to the 50s and the 70s and the Vietnam War. So after the Second World War, landmines established themselves as sort of an integral part of military arsenals across the world, and especially with regards to the United States and the Soviet Union, who exported landmines, produced them, sold them, and exported them virtually everywhere. Without telling people who were at the times fighting the wars of decolonization how to actually use them, how to place them, and how to map them so they can be removed. So you can see how this later led to an absolute catastrophe and a sort of a pandemic of landmines. The outcry against the Vietnam War and the US usage of landmines, led to the signing of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which was really spearheaded by middle powers, Scandinavia and other, Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. They wanted to ban certain weapons, but they really didn't manage to do anything with this treaty, because the treaty was like, okay, you can lay landmines, but you have to map them. So the Soviet Union and the Americans gladly signed this treaty because they didn't have to do anything. Fast forward to the Soviet-Afghan War, where Soviets used a lot of one particular type of landmine, which you can see in that corner up there. It is, in vernacular, it is called a parrot landmine, or a butterfly. It's very small, and sometimes it's painted in different colors, so kids mistake it for toys and they die. But the landmine itself is designed to demobilize an adult soldier by popping off the ankle or toes, but not to kill. But if you have a small child, they can easily be killed by this landmine. Now, the presence of international press and foreign surgeons really sort of,
That was also distributed by airplane, right?
yes, thank you, good point. Yeah, so this landmine in particular does not need to be placed manually, so you can just drop a lot of them from airplanes. And so the Soviets really seeded Afghanistan with these landmines. And unlike in Vietnam, where this was not as visible in sort of the global, I guess, discourse, the international press in Afghanistan, had access to these various hospitals and the foreign surgeons who, acquainted the world with the injuries, the type of injuries that the local populations were sustaining because of these landmines. And this caused a substantial outcry in the Western Hemisphere. Then we move on to the 80s. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and Mikhail Gorbachev's new thinking foreign policy, which opened up a window of opportunity for humanitarian demining to actually emerge. So what happens as the Soviets are withdrawing, a couple of Brits decide that they want to go and clean some landmines in Afghanistan, because they, like most other people in the Western Hemisphere, were deeply, deeply impressed. Is there a word with negative connotations here? Impressed? Or deeply disturbed by the Soviet usage of landmines in Afghanistan. So they ship out and they start the organization called the Halo Trust. MAG is founded a year later, and the UN deploys the very first mission to the Afghanistan. 3 years later, Soviet Union disintegrates, and the US is now enjoying its triumphant unipolar moment. The same year, a couple of NGOs decide that now is the time to start aggressively campaigning to completely ban these outrageous weapons that, the Soviet-Afghan War brought back to worldwide attention. So the next year, they start the international campaign to ban landmines. And by 1997, they actually succeeded. And in 1997, the Mine Ban Treaty was signed in Ottawa by 120 states out of 150 who attended. And the same year, the United Nations establishes its dedicated service for demining. In 1998, another key organization is established by Switzerland and a couple other countries. And that same organization, between 98 and 99, starts to test different technologies that would aid this process of demining. And they come up with something called IMSMA, which is the information management system. So you have a software where you put in data so you can sort of visualize where you have suspected hazardous area, landmines, and so on. In 1999, this treaty enters into force, and by 2001, the UN publishes something called International Mine Action Standards. And by 2003, the software and this become the standard for demining. So by this time, And now you may think, okay, there's something called humanitarian demining, but is it really a regime? It is, because regime refers to a way of doing things that is systematic and also imposed by someone. And I'm just gonna, this is the timeline that we just went over. And this is what that regime looks like. So once you map it, this is how it looks like. At the core of this regime are the international mine action standards, which are quite literally imposed, exported and imposed on the client states, so the states that have the mine problem. And in this massive regime, you have various UN agencies, you have the actual organizations that demine, who at the same time helped create these standards and now uphold them and export them to other countries, literally going into, say, Afghanistan or Cambodia or Vietnam and telling people, this is how you demine. You have to start with this procedure, you have to do non-technical survey, you have to do technical survey, you have to follow all these steps to be compliant with the best practices out there, which is the IMAS. And this is how we demine today. This is what humanitarian demining looks like. And it is, as I mentioned earlier, something that we associate with post-conflict countries. Something that when we think of demining, we typically think of a life-saving ritual. And historically, all these demining organizations have only gone to demine once the war is over. And they help restore agricultural lands. They help people go back to the places where they used to live. They're there to help repair the social fabric, the social and physical geographic fabric of the state, so to say. But then we experienced some sort of empirical shock in 2022 and 23. I'm sure you have seen headlines like this, at least at some point in the past few years. So what exactly happened? When on February 24th, after the full-scale invasion against Ukraine was launched, the very small demining program that Ukraine had was terminated because it is an active war zone. But what happened next was the actual empirical shock. Not only did the program resume, but all these organizations who have never stepped foot in Ukraine suddenly started flocking to demine Ukraine, which is very anomalous. These organizations to demine post-war countries are flocking to a country that is at active war to demine. Not only that, so the number of organizations demining, it triples. The CEO of the largest demining organization in the world, Halo Trust, comes out saying that demining in Ukraine is an essential war work. And he even defended the transfer of anti-personnel landmines from US to Ukraine recently. And how could someone who runs a demining organization support a decision to transfer landmines? That's very anomalous. So we see a change in the script. So from the 80s until the early 2020s, we have this orthodox humanitarian script of demining. As I said, was presumed something post-war apolitical, anti-geopolitical. When you wouldn't ever think of territorial practice or making territory when you think of demining. It's a life-saving ritual that erases material effects of conflict. It signals the advent of peace, and it sort of embodies the 1990s liberal humanitarian norms and the Mine Ban Treaty and such. But then this happens. So how did we come to this? So this leads me to the research question, which I walked into this research. The first is the observation that the demining efforts are happening despite the active war. And because of that, this process cannot possibly be the same as it is in the post-war setting. Because the wartime context is bound to produce a different format of demining, right? And that would have distinct territorial consequences. And the second is the realization, the assumption, and then the realization, because the empirical evidence supports it, is that demining is a form of territorial practice. It is easy to imagine how placing a landmine or mining a particular area is an act of creating territory, because you're creating a zone of exclusion and denying access to the other. But you wouldn't think that when you think of demining. But it is a form of territorial practice, because by removing landmines, you're opening or reopening space and allowing for certain sociopolitical activities to take place there. So it opens up mobility corridors, it unlocks agricultural land, it allows people to inhabit areas that were uninhabited because of the landmine threat. So the question then is, how does the larger geopolitical context in which demining takes place shape this process, its goals, priorities, forms, outcomes, and what does this reveal about demining as a practice of territory? So I decided to focus on these 5 areas to answer this question. And I decided to look to juxtapose and compare Ukraine with Bosnia. Why? Bosnia is the oldest demining program in Ukraine, and is the oldest that is still running. Before those headlines that I showed you earlier, Bosnia was the most contaminated country in Europe. And there are also other structural similarities. Both countries are post-socialist. One is in the European southeastern periphery, the other one is in the eastern periphery. And of course, there's the similarity between the two conflicts. Both countries experience or are experiencing separatist conflicts with interstate, intrastate, and international dimensions. So there's sort of a baseline that allows for this comparison. And Ukraine is the latest and the newest demining program in Ukraine. So let's look at these 5 elements and see what they reveal about demining. And before I get to that, so the core argument of my interpretation and research is that it is exactly the geopolitical context that determines what form demining takes and what meaning it embodies. And it does so by determining what are the actual goals we want to achieve by demining a particular place. And the goals determine what methods we use and what places we prioritize. And this determines the outcomes and thus form and meaning of demining. If there's anything unclear or confusing, feel free to interrupt. I will just breeze through this, but this is research that took 3 years and included process tracing. So tracing the entire process of demining in both Ukraine and Bosnia. In the case of Ukraine, that's a nearly 11-year timeline. For Bosnia, nearly 30-year timeline to sort of reconstruct the causal sequence that allowed me to link mine laying, clearance decisions, and post-war and wartime territorial recovery. I also completed 53 interviews with 14 different demining organizations. And of course, I triangulated this interview data with thousands of pages of reports from demining organizations, demining operators, and I also completed 2 months of ethnographic research in Bosnia, where I actually went into minefields. This is the closest I've gotten to an actual live landmine. Sadly, this was not possible in Ukraine because my university didn't allow me to travel to an active war zone, but it is something that I plan to do once the war is over, and I hope that will be soon. So let's talk those 5 elements that I looked at. Demining structure in Bosnia. In its entirety, demining structure in Bosnia was created by the United States, NATO, and UN. The literal peace agreement that was created by the United States and the European Community in 1995 said the 3 belligerents have to remove their landmines, and they have 30 days to do so. They realized very quickly that that would be impossible to remove all those landmines in a month. So they decided to set up a demining program. And they did so. And for the couple of years after the war, the entire demining program was run by NATO and UN. So Americans trained former combatants to demine, and because they wouldn't work together, they have to set up 3 different training camps. So there was a camp for Bosniaks, a camp for Croats, and a camp for Serbs. And the UN set up the entire system that, as you may have guessed, was done so in collaboration with the Geneva Center, with demining operators. So this is where that regime structure comes into place. So the entire program started, funded, and designed by the international community. This is what that structure looks like in Ukraine. Okay, I should mention, so the program today is mainly run by something called the Demining Commission, that where three people sit, a Bosniak, a Serb, and a Croat, because we have to fill that ethnic key. And then there's something called the Bosnia and Herzegovina Mine Action Center. And it has about 150 people, and they're technically all advisors to these three people, who, by the way, do not have any sort of experience or background in demining, but we have to fill out the forms, right? That's mandated by our dear Constitution and the Dayton Peace Agreement. So what these guys do is they give out certificates to organizations that allow them to demine. They conduct quality control, and this, I was able to see this while I was visiting different minefields. They would just show up and go straight in and check if the people doing the mining work there are actually doing the good job and actually following the IMAS, the standards that I mentioned before. So that's what they do. And then you have the different mining operators. And a key thing here is that the armed forces of Bosnia, which previously was three different armies and then reunited into one army, military force in 2005, they have no say in the structure. They're merely an operator, and they demine if the government tells them to do so. But this is what we have in Ukraine, and this entire structure, the initial talks about setting up some form of structure started well before 2014, but it stalled because it didn't really matter. The only landmines in Ukraine at that point were landmines left from the Second World War. So this entire structure today was actually created in the past couple of years, actually between 2002 and 2024. And what can we see here? In Bosnia, you see that the entire structure is actually run by the Ministry of Civil Affairs, because that's how the US and the UN and NATO wanted it, because it was a peace and normalization oriented endeavor. In Ukraine, we observe competing authorities. So there's the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, which has its own sort of organization to manage demining, but the Ministry of Interior of Ukraine also has another one. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine also has the National Mine Action Authority, which technically is above these two, and it furnishes it with its secretariat. Now, there are other ministries that are involved in this, but the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine still takes primacy in these decisions. And then here are the operators. So you can tell already just how central the Ministry of Defense is to the demining process in Ukraine, because it is an active thing. Now, speaking of demining actors and methods, in Bosnia, ever since the demining program started, it has been purely humanitarian demining. So the armed forces demine according to IMAS, the Civil Protection Administrations do so as well. The international demining organizations do that, and local NGOs and commercial companies. Now, the only difference between these and these two is they don't get to pick what they demine. The government tells them, you have to demine this area. And the armed forces in particular, because they have helicopters, are usually called upon with mountaintops need to be demined, because other organizations do not have that. The international organizations can just pick what they want to demine, and they do so in coordination with their donors, which are individual governments, but also other international organizations. But regardless, the type of demining they practice is complies with the IMIS practices and rules, whereas in Ukraine, prior to 2022, there was a small-scale humanitarian demining program in Donbas that was terminated for a few months after February 2022, only to be revived and actually transformed into something completely different. So now you have 3 different types of demining happening in Ukraine. So my initial assumption walking into this research was that humanitarian demining is not actually practiced and cannot be practiced during the war. Instead, it is all military demining. But what I found during research is something that I consider even more fascinating. And that is that all these 3 different types of demining coexist at the same time. So you have the armed forces, which practice military demining, and they're trying to breach the front lines. You have the state emergency service, which used to practice humanitarian demining, but ever since February 2022, they established a whole new different way of demining, which they term operational demining. And they focus on traffic critical infrastructure, and they can go inside the 20-kilometer combat zone. Whereas the humanitarian NGOs and commercial companies who practice humanitarian demining are barred by the Ukrainian government from getting close, any more than 20 kilometers close to the front line. So there are only certain areas where they're allowed to perform the work. Now let's look at the process of prioritizing, and this is where I think it gets the most interesting. The process of prioritizing which areas are demined first in Bosnia was, as you may guess, created by the US, NATO, the UN, and other few organizations out of Switzerland and UK. So they decided that they were going to create a mathematical formula and calculate what areas have high risk, what areas have medium risk, and what areas have low risk. So they create this formula which looks at the number of people living in a particular area, the total number of people, and then the number of people who are in direct risk from the landmines there, and then the size of that area, and then they come up with these numbers which tell them, oh, this is high risk, so this is category 1. And that's how they created their priority lists. And you may guess that because the formula takes into consideration the population number, what areas got prioritized? Densely populated areas. So there was an obvious sort of urban bias there, which makes sense. A single landmine in Central Park is far more dangerous than 100 landmines in the middle of desert somewhere, right? So this is the sort of prioritization matrix that was created. And so areas, they're densely populated, were prioritized over everything else. The second category was agricultural lands, and the third category, forests, and so on. However, there was so-called category 0 in Bosnia as well. And the category 0 took precedence over anything else. And that category is suspected mass graves. And this sort of reflects the thinking of the immediate sort of post-war political life in Bosnia, where the priority was to find and arrest war criminals and hand them over to The Hague to process them for war crimes. So if there's an area where someone suspected, where it was suspected that they're mass graves, that area would get demined first. And so let's move on to the territorial outcome of this form of demining. So in Bosnia, as in Ukraine, the areas demined mined the most were the front lines. And this created something very interesting in Bosnia, because Bosnia, in the aftermath of the war, was split between 2 different entities, Republic of Srpska here, and then the Federation of Bosnia here, and then the little enclave called Brčko district up in the northeast. People demining in the two entities were only responsible for demining within the entities. So what this created is it actually fortified these front lines from the war, because even today, if Republic of Srpska were to secede from the Federation, they would have an actual border made out of landmines, because it is, the landmines are placed at the exact inter-entity boundary line, which is no one's responsibility. But the urban areas like Sarajevo here, which was besieged, was cleared fairly quickly. Gorazde, which was another town that was besieged, and a few other areas.
You know, Emina, I was there when the Jewish cemetery had been mined by the Serbs, because it was elevated up on the higher up on the mountainside. And the Norwegians demined it.
Norwegian people say.
Yeah. So I was there, and it was the first time you were allowed to go into the cemetery after the war. But I became very cognizant of minefields because I was in Eastern Bosnia, in my first post, and I would not go off the road. There's just no way. And I did see mined areas when I was in Eastern Bosnia for sure.
That was my childhood, because I went to school in Iliash, and the road from Visoko to Iliash was a site of some very nasty battles. So the entire road was landmine, and it was like that for almost 11 years.
So were there any mines that were put along the airport? Did that ever happen?
Yes, but that was removed by NATO. So there was this
Because
very,
that was a front line there.
but there was this very brief window. So when they reached a peace agreement and 60,000 NATO troops were about to be deployed to Bosnia to enforce the peace agreement, they had NATO troops do something called military mine lifting. So they removed landmines from certain military bases and airports, so they could actually deploy there.
I see.
But this was very brief. This took a month, and then they just handed over everything to the locals and pretty much forced them to work together after initially setting up 3 camps. So going back to the territorial outcomes. So the Bosnian case sort of reflects this very logic that was configured into the Dayton Peace Agreement, and this logic of ethno-territoriality, right? And the demining itself sort of reflects that logic, because the front line, the inter-entity boundary line, is still mined. The entity civil protection agencies demine within their own entity borders. We have 3 people sitting at the commission, just like we have 3 presidents. So the demining structure, the entirety of the institutional demining structure reflects the sort of the political, the ethnicized and ethno-territorialized logic of Bosnia's political system. For Ukraine, there is no agreed prioritization criteria countrywide. But that gave rise to something more interesting, and that is that there are 3 different ways in which demining areas are prioritized in Ukraine. So the armed forces obviously are prioritizing frontline areas and active battle areas. The NGOs working in Ukraine, be they international or local NGOs, but particularly international, they have their own sort of quote unquote humanitarian matrices that they use to determine where they're going to demine. So HALO, for example, looks at the population density and proximity to schools and hospitals. The Norwegian People's Aid, they ran casualty history with local authority requests. The Swiss Foundation for Demining, they filter by beneficiary numbers, and they have a very strict clause on not doing anything that could be remotely seen as helping the Ukrainian military. One of the directors that I interviewed from the Swiss Foundation gave me an example how at some point some local military administrators requested that they purchase some pens for them. And they were like, okay, we have to run this by our donors, and the donors said no, because it would still be a purchase for the military, and they have to uphold this purely humanitarian outlook. So they refused. They're there to demine and nothing else. And then there's another formula for prioritizing areas, a formula used by Ukraine's State Emergency Service Unit, which is critical infrastructure and mobility corridors first, settlements second, and then agriculture, forests, and water bodies. However, despite these different sort of ideas what to prioritize, on the ground, these priorities are ultimately decided by the Ministry of Defense and actual local military administrators. And this is what I been told by CESU, by the different NGOs and employees of the National Mine Action Authority of Ukraine. And this is what that territorial outcome looks like in Ukraine. And by the way, this is very up to date. So this is a map from today. One thing that you will notice that is quite interesting. So this is what I mentioned, the Emina software. So all countries with demining problem, they have to use this to map where they have landmines, what areas they look like, what areas are cleared, and so on. So Ukraine, of course, uses it. And this map does not only show humanitarian demining and operational demining, but also combat demining. But despite that, all of this is labeled as humanitarian demining activity or activities, which is really telling about this paradigm shift in what we understand is humanitarian and what is not. And you can see here that based on these green sort of taglines, which means that the area has been cleared, you can tell what areas are actually prioritized on the ground, and that is front lines and Kiev Oblast. So, you know, there is a sort of similarity with Bosnia, in which an urban area is prioritized, with Kiev in this case. But despite the existence of humanitarian demining, frontlines still take precedence over everything else. So, and this is how, and what this tells us is that demining is actually a really key part of the war effort, of Ukraine's war effort against Russia. And let's look at the funding, and then I will conclude, and then we can have hopefully a productive conversation. When it comes to the funding pipelines, Bosnia has had since the beginning a multi-donor international humanitarian pipeline, where the US, EU, Germany, and individual governments of Germany, Norway, Canada, Japan, but also the UN, and then the Slovenian NGO that sort of pulled money from different countries to send money to Bosnia for demining. And there's a domestic pipeline, mandated by law, but the state level government and also the entity level governments barely have never actually met the share that they were supposed to meet. So there's sort of a chronic funding deficit in Bosnia. In Ukraine, when you look at the funding pipelines, you see something very, very different from all the other countries with the demining program. You have the typical humanitarian pipeline with different international NGOs, individual governments, but also the World Bank, the UNDP, and so on. And this pipeline goes directly for organizations that are performing humanitarian demining. But then you have the security sector assistance, which funds breaching front lines and clearing battle areas. And then a third pipeline, which is probably the most fascinating one, and that is a pipeline that goes directly through Ministry of Economy and funds innovation and technological innovation in demining. And two key funders here are Amazon Web Services and Meta. So, what have the results of this research showed me? one key takeaway that I hope you can see too is that demining, instead of being this benign humanitarian apolitical process, is actually a very, very political and very geopolitical process. It is a process that reconfigures territories and cannot possibly be divorced from the larger sort of international power constellations in which they're embedded. What I term what I conceptualize as geopolitical context. It's a concept that describes three different scales, which are sort of nested in each other, local, national, and international, that affect the socio political dynamic in a particular place. So what we can observe in Bosnia is that Bosnia pretty much incubated the international liberal humanitarian demining regime. All of the clearance efforts, they began in this triumphant moment of US unipolar dominance and liberal peace orthodoxy, a near unquestioned liberal humanitarian script. And in this geopolitical context, landmines were cast as something that is savage, that belongs to the 20th century, that is uncivilized, and the clearance efforts were come down with a sort of a moral balance to restore safe space, for return of refugees, for life to return to normal, for peace to hold. And when you look at the demining process on the ground, you can see this. The former combatants were forced to demine together. So what the US and NATO did, they would put people who literally shot at each other to start demining together. Which you could argue was an attempt to repair the social fabric. But then Mubarak undid a lot of that. It made the local structures prioritize areas that were key for peace treaty to hold and for life to at least feel a little bit normal and to reverse material effects of war. But we see something very different in Ukraine, something that you could describe as a post-humanitarian present, in which three different types of demining exist, three different pipelines of funding, a structure where there's competing authorities, a structure that is at once humanitarian and civilian, but also very military and defense oriented. A structure that really tells us that demining is a key part of Ukraine's fight against Russia. And demining has been operationalized into a de facto hinge of war. So it's not just humanitarian aftermaths, but it's sort of this, what we're seeing is a situation where saving lives, reviving markets through technological innovation and also freeing agricultural lands and enabling military to move. They're no longer sequential, but they're happening at the same time. And this is this novel and hybrid logic of territorial recovery through demining in Ukraine. So every sort of hectare cleared today in Ukraine functions as both humanitarian victory and a tactical foothold for tomorrow's fight. And it really collapses this presumed boundary between war making and peace building. And I want to give you some other key findings about Ukraine. So as I said, this could be termed as a post-humanitarian presence. So landmines are not only are these international organizations who have only ever demined in the aftermath of wars flock to Ukraine to demine the country as it fights a war against another country, but we began to think about landmines differently. They're fine now because they're going to help the Baltics and Poland and Finland and Ukraine fight off the Russian invader, right? 4 countries have decided to pull out of the mine ban treaty because they need landmines. So this is a sort of unprecedented present where demining is taking a different format and different meaning, but also are thinking about this weapon. So Ukraine's mine action then fuses humanitarian norms with wartime utility. And this is where clearance becomes operational rather than post-conflict activity. So in this case, demining in Ukraine really is territorial statecraft, right? Because almost all of landmines planted in Ukraine were planted by Russians, not by Ukrainians. So so it is by clearing these landmines that Ukraine is reclaiming sovereignty. And then that reclaimed land can be either used for the movement of troops to resume agriculture that feeds the population, but also helps fund Ukraine's war effort. And as I said, as you saw in the structure slide, there's a sort of hybrid civil military governance with these twin authorities and twin sort of departments that manage demining. And yeah, I'll skip this other stuff. I just want to conclude that if you take out anything from today's talk, let it be that whether in peace or war, demining reopens space, as I said earlier, thereby undoing certain forms of territory and creating other forms of territorial arrangements. And humanitarian demining, or just demining, is actually a regime. It's a durable bundle of laws, standards, institutions, and metrics that are exported and imposed on client states. And this regime translates these universalist humanitarian norms into spatial priorities. And this thereby governs who and what is reopened first. Where can life resume? Who is allowed to live, and who is going to be made to live in the proximity of danger and the possibility of death and dismemberment? So this is where the Foucault's biopolitics and Membe's necropolitics come into place. This is something I haven't addressed in this presentation because it would just be too much of everything. But it is in my dissertation. And finally, so what we can see, looking at Bosnia and Ukraine together, is that Bosnia's demining has emerged it's sprung out of this liberal peace settlement. And this underwrites territorial recovery fixated on reversing the material effects of war. Now, it hasn't succeeded in doing so, but the logic is apparent. Whereas in active war coalition, Ukraine, the same toolkit is redirected toward terrain securitization. And this shows us that demining and the demining regime's meaning and effects are actually determined by the geopolitical context and not anything other than that. So that would be all.
It's amazing. I just have a diplomatic observation to share. When I was in Bosnia, I was advisor to 2 US ambassadors that led the OSCE. And I just want to say, and this is good to know for Mark in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, is that Japan and Norway punch way above their weight. They are remarkable diplomats, and they're driven by, humanitarian compassion, but they're also very sophisticated. And I think they outflank most of the diplomats that I dealt with in Bosnia. I mean, the French were nowhere. I mean, they basically alienated everybody. But I just want to say that it's really interesting to see their names over and over again, and I'm not surprised. But it's also really commendable what they do and how they serve the world community. So I just want to make that remark.
Thank you.
Regarding the Ukrainian demining dynamic and blurring the lines between war making and peace building, do you think that is an anomaly, or is that the start of a new trend? In other words, is Russia responsible for this, or is this a new global mindset?
I think so. In my dissertation, I drew a parallel at how it was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that sort of opened up the space for this entire regime and way of removing explosives to emerge. And now it is again Russia as sort of the inheritor of the Soviet Empire who has caused this paradigm shift because of how much landmines they seeded in Ukraine. But I don't think it's Russia. It's only Russia who is causing this. I think there's several reasons for this. The United States and NATO allies have a particular interest in helping Ukraine fight this war. So I think this is a significant part of the reason why all these different organizations who are actually funded by these governments flock to Ukraine, and why we're seeing this different way of thinking about landmines, because now it matters for our livelihood. We're defending democracy. We're defending this liberal sort of international ordering. So I think it's that I doubt we're gonna see the Ukraine case elsewhere unless it is again Russia attacking. So I doubt that we're gonna see this in Bosnia, right? Because Serbia is not a major power. Srpska, even less so. They do not have nukes. They are not significant state players in the international arena. So I don't think we're going to see it in places like Bosnia. But and I doubt this sort of thinking is going to sort of last unless Russia keeps invading other countries and seeding landmines, which is entirely possible.
Do you think, once the war does end, Ukraine, again, we don't know how that's gonna go, but, what can Ukraine learn from what's happening in Bosnia with the demining, if it ever goes back to this humanitarian, fully, 100%, fully, what can it learn from what's happening in Bosnia? What can they do that's good? What should they do that maybe
So
they're doing?
So they've actually already learned a lot, which is something that is very admirable about Ukrainian demining program. So when I spoke to Ukrainians who are either actually doing the demining or running demining programs through the government or different NGOs, they were actively talking to representatives from all the other countries that have had the landmine problem. And they've actually gone to Bosnia to do the training. And I think they're learning a lot from other countries and Bosnia too, because there is this sort of understanding in Ukraine now that we do not want to do this for 100 years. We do not want the foreigners to be here for decades. We want this done as fast as possible. And I think this is what's spurring this really incredible technological innovation in Ukraine. They're using satellites to map landmine areas. They're actively using drones. Bosnia just started using drones a couple of years back. I mean, it is quite tragic. And don't even get me started on some other places. But if there's one additional thing that I think Ukrainians should learn is not to let the entire process be hijacked by political and especially ethno-national entrepreneurs, because this is something that has happened in Bosnia and which was insanely detrimental to the demining process. Millions and millions were embezzled and simply stolen. And I really, really hope this doesn't happen in Ukraine. And because these large sums disappeared, were never accounted for, certain organizations pulled out and they said, okay, we can't do this anymore. We're not going to keep demining. Halo was one of those organizations. And in fact, to this day, they deny that they've ever been in Bosnia. So I assume that there was quite a significant corruption scandal that they went through, which made them pull out. The Swiss Foundation for Demining, their very first demining program was in Bosnia. They left after a couple of years. And this was exactly at the time where these corruption scandals started to come out. So that's one thing that I think Ukraine should take notice of, because it seems like the other things they've already got it figured out. They don't want to drag this on forever, which I think is very important, because also a lot of the demining processes elsewhere have been hijacked by demining operators and administrators who have an interest in dragging this as long as they're landmines, they have, as long as they're landmines in the ground, they have a job. And so they typically inflate the areas that are contaminated, prevent operators from demining with machines, and they say, oh no, you have to use manual demining, which is the slowest, but also the most accurate form of demining. So I've heard many experiences like that one.
Thank you.
So the question is rather reflection. My dad is working in the demining unit in Ukraine, so that's very relatable on many personal levels. But the story is that he actually worked in the state emergency service first, and they were trained to do demining despite most of the people were not actually, they didn't have the right skills to do it. So the training part was interesting because it had to be so accelerated that everything that is supposed to last, let's say, half a year would be squeezed into 1 or 2 months, which of course prevents people from gaining the right skills at the scale that is needed. And I think that might have contributed to some casualties then in the fields, and we've heard a lot about that happening these days. Now he's with a private company, which kind of for him makes things better and easier. But still there is this political dynamic, and you mentioned these two ministries, and I think there are some rivalry in place. But at the same time, it's also quite unsafe. And yeah, just wanted to share that it's great that there's a lot of support from international donors in particular, but also Hello Trust, for example, doesn't provide safeguards from mobilization. And that creates a lot of tension as well, because men who are demining, and this is usually people doing this job, they could be mobilized anytime, and that creates a lot of instability in that field.
Which is why a lot of women have been attracted to take upon demining work. By the way, I think it's very noble of your dad to do such really dangerous work. You know, a lot of the miners that I spoke to, they would say, you know, landmines or whatever, once you know, you learn the procedure, and if you just follow the procedure, it's the safest job out there. And I'm like, there's no way in hell this could ever be the safest job out there. And then there are other deminers who would say, I've made 2 mistakes in my life. One is actually signing up to be a deminer, and the second is walking into a minefield to do this job. So there is a sort of split there, but I think it's very noble because someone needs to do this. And at the end of the day, as I said, a human deminer is to this day the most accurate deminer out there. So regardless of all the tech innovation, the satellite usage, the drones equipped with thermal scanners that Ukraine is now pioneering, that is all fine. Dogs are fine, rats, and other technologies, but a human deminer armed with just a metal detector and the prodder is still the most accurate deminer out there. And this is fascinating because it means that nothing has really changed since the Second World War, really. We haven't made that technological breakthrough.
Didn't you have your hand up? Did you have your hand up?
I have a question though.
Sure.
I want to talk about this, you said that the borders, the front line are usually where most work is done for demining. So I would assume that places like Sarajevo or, like Tuzla or the main cities probably are more supposed to be mined.
Yeah.
Would you say that the more rural areas, those regions are more neglected and have more neglected?
And what was the last part?
Do you think those areas are more neglected and have more mines?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that this is what the data shows.
Yeah.
And this is something I addressed in my dissertation, but I didn't want to I sort of in this presentation I try to distill the whole work into something that is I guess digestible. But I address this issue as something that it makes the demining process simultaneously biopolitical and necropolitical. And what I mean by that, by prioritizing certain areas. So it's easy to think of demining as something that saves lives, right? Which would make it biopolitical. You're saving human bodies and particular groups from dying or being injured, maimed by landmines. But by prioritizing certain areas, other areas are not prioritized. And this is where demining is exposing certain populations to death and injury by deeming them not a priority. So it is not always, it's counterintuitive, but what this tells us is that demining is not always a life-saving work. And this is certainly what has happened in Bosnia. And areas are, still contaminated with landmines, as I said, is the inter-entity boundary line, which mostly runs through forests, small villages. And these people have had to, especially in small villages, have had to learn how to live with landmines. And there's actually quite a good study done by David Henning, who is he's Czech. And he's an anthropologist. He's teaching in Holland now, but he went to some of these villages in Bosnia to research how these people are navigating living with landmines. And it's a really fascinating study because these people have had to, they learn how to navigate the landscape through stories from their fathers, uncles, grandpas who fought the war and were like, oh yeah, in this spot I shot at that guy and I remember him blowing up, so we should avoid this spot. So this is how they're this is their sort of geographic navigation, and they still have to make a living. So a lot of these people are foraging mushrooms and cutting down trees to use as firewood and then to sell them. And it is exactly those areas are contaminated. So they've had to learn how to navigate this and just live with the possibility of either dying or being severely crippled at any point.
Are there also some local initiatives on these people who are living on the borders between the various parts of Bosnia to try to demine these areas?
So there were certain initiatives, but this was and same thing in Ukraine. If you remember, there were quite a bit of reports of different farmers in Ukraine who just could not wait for either the state emergency service or HALO or MAG or NPA or military to show up and demine their fields. So they repurposed their tractors into machines to demine because God knows where they are on that priority list. And they're certainly not number one. And there were similar sort of things that were happening in Bosnia, the immediate aftermath of war. And people would try to remove landmines themselves. And because of that, for the first couple of years, the casualties were significantly high. But then after a few years, they dropped down to single digits. So now 1 or 2 or 0 people die from landmines in Bosnia every year. Actually, we had one boy, 18-year-old boy die this year, which is quite tragic because the landmine was actually planted before he was born. So there were those initiatives. I've also heard of anecdotal stories from demining operators where people would wait and then get so upset, but then when foreigners as in international demining operators come in, they would try to prevent them from demining, and they would say something like, we only trust the military, we want the military to demine here. There are also stories of people quote unquote harvesting landmines. And you can only do that if you've been through military training and you know how to handle a landmine, because you have to disable it in order to carry it. So there were people who were harvesting landmines. So they were moving them from known minefields and placing them at a certain areas to prevent refugees from coming back. So this was a particular problem. It's no longer the case obviously, but
I mean, I was there right after the war, so uh, they hired a lot, there were a lot of Americans that were former soldiers that were hired to demine, and I actually knew a number of them, but
yeah,
yeah.
they were training the former combatants to
Mhm.
demine.
I'm sure I'm the only person in this room that learned how to deploy and arm a landmine, which was part of my military training.
Can you teach me?
Anyway, I was very afraid, you're very afraid of it even when you're doing it, until you get really comfortable, but I didn't have that much time, thank God.
Landmines are one thing that, so growing up in post-war Bosnia, this was the one thing that I was afraid of the most. And this is something that I think is a very sad reality and something that is going to be part of Ukrainian children's childhoods. I I personally don't remember a moment where I learned about landmines. I always knew. And because I guess Bosnia was so contaminated and a lot of children were dying. So they were trying to teach the kids in school to not approach anything shiny, anything that could possibly be a landmine. And so I remember having these lectures, I think monthly or every couple weeks. So something that's really ingrained. So I don't have a conscious memory of not knowing about landmines. And it makes me really sad that this is going to be the reality for Ukrainian children. And it changes the way you interact with the physical geography. For me, I never pick up anything from the ground. It doesn't matter if I'm in Bosnia or anywhere else. I do not pick up stuff from the ground because I was taught not to ever pick up stuff.
Yeah.
Only if I drop something, but if I could see a case of whatever, a full case of money, I'm not touching that because it could be a landmine.
Yeah, there was also one of the slides, it was a map of Ukraine with like the mine territories, mine territories. Do you have like any explanation? I mean, you show like the priorities, so like which zones are demined first, but I'm just thinking like it makes me think that the northern territory, for example, like Sumy region and part of Kharkiv region, they are not demined, maybe because I mean, I know that civilians live there, so maybe civilian infrastructure was like demined, and like some fields and forests they are still mined in case if Russians like start the offensive again from the territory of Belarus, or like generally to the Sumy region. Because I remember I am from Kyiv, and I always lived near the big forest. This forest is so huge that it goes to Chernihiv region, and this forest was mined by Ukrainian military forces in the beginning of the war. So like the civilians were not allowed to go there, but it was done like in case Russians come, so they can't go like from the Chernihiv region to Kyiv through this forest. So do you think there's like any strategical demining, let's say, and like some territories are not demined purposefully in case because there are no guarantees that Russians will not come in there again, or it's just the issue of priorities and it will be demined when the time comes?
No, I think you're absolutely right. There is a strategy to not demining certain areas. Now, you have to make a distinction between Ukrainians until recently have not used anti-personnel landmines because they signed a mine ban treaty. They mostly destroyed the stocks they had, so they didn't actually have anti-personnel landmines to place. Now they do. So they actually placed anti-tank landmine, anti-vehicle landmines. Across the border with Belarus. And, it is entirely possible that they're not deliberately not removing certain anti-personnel landmines close to borders because it actually helps, prevent ground attacks. So, but it also, makes a lot of sense not really communicating this decision out loud because it is a strategic military operation. And my interlocutors in Ukraine have actually emphasized to me that, you know, a lot of information about demining on the ground in Ukraine is kept somewhat secret. So it's not like all of it is out there, because demining operators, deminers have been targeted by actual Russian military, but also Russian military intelligence. They've, you know, tried to hack different programs and softwares that are critical to demining. They're actually shelled, you know, and bombed deminers. Even the office of the Swiss Foundation for Demining was shelled. So it is entirely possible and very likely that's the reason.
I also have one question. I mean, I don't know how to. Well, there were like videos, things like a proven fact that Russians, especially when they are living, they mine like everything, like civilian infrastructure. I don't know, children's toys and everything. So like, it took a long time to demine like every, I don't know, like room, every small corner in Bucha, for example, like in Kyiv region. Was it the case, because he also showed like a map of the how it was mined in Bosnia, so it was like mostly on the front line, as you said. Was it a case of such, I don't know, like huge mining of civilian infrastructure in Bosnian war? And like, what does it identify? What does it mean? Why do they do it? Is it like a kind of military strategy, or it's just like to cause as much civilian victims as is possible?
That's a very good point. And I actually addressed the entire history of the development of landmines as a weapon and the way that Bosnia was mined versus how Ukraine was mined in the actual dissertation. I deliberately left it out today. But there are similarities and then there are differences. There are actual legitimate and reports from Ukraine and pictures and videos that you mentioned where, you know, landmines would be stuffed into toys and quite literally everything would be mined. To the point that there were also instances where Russians, while retreating, would leave some of their, I guess, dead comrades behind and stack so they would put sometimes they would put an anti-tank landmine and then stack some anti-personnel landmines. And then they would put dead bodies on there. And then they would also put landmines in between them. So there's like a massive landmine sandwich. So if you attempt to move anything, you would blow up and your vehicle and a lot of other people around you. And this is a particularly brutal mining strategy. And this was not, it's not very identical to the Bosnian case, because in Bosnia, all three sides used landmines, but it was only the Serbian side who actually had a lot of landmines. And not only that, they knew how to use them, how to place them, and they created minefield maps. The Bosnian, the Croatian side did not have as much landmines, and a lot of people were actually not trained, so they didn't know how to strategically use the landmines. So some of the former combatants I spoke to, they told me, "Oh yeah, we just put them randomly. We were just given landmines, and we were supposed to place them, and we did so." But there were no reports of situations similar to what we've seen in Ukraine, where you know, quite literally every corner in when it comes to civilian infrastructures is mined. Yeah.
And what does it identify? Like, what does it mean? Or
Well, it reveals something about Russia's war strategy, right? It is not only about targeting the military structures, but it's also about preventing civilian return and preventing, because remember, territory, the thinnest definition of territory, it's a place, it's a piece of land that has something done to it. A more thick conception is it's a place of land that's claimed by someone, and which prevents others from encroaching on it. But there are quite a bit of other, even thicker conceptions of territory. And one of them is that a key part of any territory is human bodies. A piece of land with a boundary is not territory by itself unless it is for certain people and they're there. And in that sense, even, human reproduction is territorial because you're populating that territory with the right kind of bodies. So then keeping this in mind, you can look at the way the Russian forces have mined Ukraine, and sort of discern what the logic there is, and that is preventing any sort of resumption of normal life, or claiming or reclaiming territorial sovereignty in a particular place.
I would just say this, if somebody knows something about military. The Russian military is not a professional military. It's not, does not have the discipline and the leadership to actually even resupply on a highway. I mean, they could not resupply. If you can't resupply, you can't move arms, you can't move people or anything. And so I've heard about the bodies being, stacked and with landmines placed in them or whatever kind of mines that were used. And that's just something a professional army's not going to do unless your back is against the wall and you're being overrun or something like that. It's interesting to know how they're trained and what their theory and their strategies are. That's really interesting to me because that's very unusual to do
Because
that.
this is where a landmine, which has been created as a weapon for defense, becomes a weapon for it becomes an offensive weapon. It's not defensive anymore.
Right.
Because you're not using it to secure a particular area from encroachment because of the threat of a landmine. And this is another thing that I address in my work, which is how, the mine warfare but mine warfare came to be. And it was really the Germans who created and pioneered the idea of a minefield, and they were very mathematical about it. So it would be a set number of landmines placed in a way that each landmine would be exactly distance from other land. So it was all calculated, and they like placing them would be a whole choreography. But this is not very common. And then if you look at the military manuals, they're exact instructions, how you create a minefield, how you create a defensive minefield.
In the German field manuals.
In American manuals too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
in
definitely
Army
in
manuals.
American
So
manuals,
you
yeah.
have a protective minefield, you have a strategic minefield,
right.
you have a phony minefield.
Mhm.
And that is all defense.
Part of the tactic.
Yeah, and it's defensive.
Yeah.
And when you create these minefields, you put up signs because those signs are supposed to repel the force that you're fighting. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is landmines being used as a offensive weapon as well, which is also happened in certain African countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would also suggest that hired militia may in fact be involved in these activities as well. Because when you're a professional, you're not going to take soldiers' bodies, your own soldiers, and put landmines in them because you basically recover your own soldiers. But the Russians, I just, it's interesting to know about this kind of stuff because it's really, that is crude. That is very crude. And you don't do that to your own soldiers' bodies.
I have just an anecdote. I spent 4 days on a Soviet military base with that when how they treat their own and how they,
Yes.
in their own living conditions. It
Yeah.
was dark side of the moon.
Oh, yeah.
And so I can actually believe it very easily.
No, I mean,
Well,
it's
but-
yeah, I mean, just an example, in the US Army, you're an officer, your soldiers eat first before you eat in the field, as an example, I mean, about how people are treated, for example.
There's severe hazing in which conscripts starve to death in the Soviet
Yes,
or the Russian,
yeah.
which the tradition Dedoshina has
Yeah,
treated.
yeah.
I was interested about the one slide with AWS and Meta helping out. The one thing that is I'd like to know is, are they donating their services? Because if they are, then they're getting huge tax breaks. I mean, they can say, we're giving hundreds of millions of dollars worth of services. And
They are.
what exactly I'm interested to know what are the services they're providing and how is the monetary value calculated, because that's a boondoggle in the making. I know for a fact that Google gives us a in-kind grant, my organization, and it's supposedly free advertising on Google, but the rates they charge us are vastly inflated compared, because I've had someone else try to advertise for the same thing and found that the rates that they received were far, far lower than the rates that we were being charged. That it was sort of like a Soviet in-kind, financial transaction. No money was actually changing hands, but for tax reporting purposes, they were giving us such an amount of service.
So they're doing two things. So both Meta and Amazon Web Services and Warren Buffett's foundation. So they're directly donating to several demining operators. So these NGOs, which in that case, there's an actual money and donation taking place. So they're giving them money so they can purchase equipment, pay the miners, train them, and so on. But then when it comes to their involvement with the Ministry of Economy, this is where it gets a little blurry, because it is not clear what monetary exchange is actually taking place, if any. What they've been open about, I think particularly Amazon Web Services, is that I guess their interest was spurred by the thermal imaging that Ukrainian forces and TESU started using, in which they would deploy these drones armed with thermal cameras. And then, because a lot of the landmines that Russians are using are Soviet made, a lot of them are metal, they would retain heat. And then they would send them out in the evening. And then because of the trapped heat, they would be able to locate them. Also, satellite imaging is another thing that they claim they're collaborating on, and AI. And this is where it is unclear. And by the way, the entirety of the mining sector is very, very secretive. So actually finding out anything that they actually do is very difficult. They do their own research. Especially Halo. Halo refuses to talk to anyone, any outside researchers. And this has not only happened to me, but a lot of other researchers. So getting them to talk about what they're doing is very difficult. So they're training certain AI models to map and recognize landmines. And it is unclear how this whole business is happening and what the actual product is going to be. But at least the Ministry of Economy and certain other international local organizations seem to have a lot of trust in training AI models to help them demine.
But I guess it's a huge, probably tax break for these guys.
Very likely, yeah.
Mark, is there anything else? I think we should probably wrap it up here.
Yeah.
It's like 20 till 6. Did you have a comment or a question? No? No? Well, I want to thank you so much for coming. And this is really, I mean, I've never had a presentation related to Bosnia like this before. It's always great to learn and be among students and scholars. So it's really a really treat. Thank you for coming. And it was really revealing and quite educational.
Well, it is my pleasure to be here. I hope I didn't confuse you or bore you. I try to make it as digestible as possible, but if this is a topic that piqued your interest, I would actually encourage you to at least read some of my dissertation because it goes into far more detail about how both countries were mined, how the landmines were developed and demining, and what the actual outcomes are of these processes. I think it's a very important
I
topic.
sent it to Mark, didn't I? Did I send it to you? No, I didn't. Okay, I will.
Yeah, I can just,
Oh, okay.
I can share
You
it
can
with
do
you.
it, sure, of course.
But I hope that, you walk out of this room with an understanding that the demining process, just like any other process dealing with the physical geography and the political on the other hand, is at the end of the day, a process that is political and can be politicized, and it's geopolitical and can be, sort of not corrupted, but it is sort of bent by these outside things. So that's all.
Thank you.